Alright, so I'll just start this video off by saying that when we're talking about non-duality, the absence of a central character owning or relating to experience, this is very paradoxical and it's very strange in the way that you might assume that I'm trying to communicate this to you as a person, and because I'm talking about it, that means that I understand it. But this character has never experienced non-duality, nor does it understand what it's talking about. Very strange that way. And what I think is important with this is that because there's no central character in that can relate to that experience, confirm that experience or remember it, or take a position on it and relate to it as something it understands. In non-duality, the way I'm going to talk about it, right, that nothing I say can be right, but the central character in that as an experience isn't there. So it's not there to confirm the experience as non-duality. It's not like that. That way it's very hard to talk about it. What I think is important to focus on is you're never going to get this. I don't get it. I'm not going to tell you something that's going to make you get it. But something has already got it. It's clear to something, but it's not a thing. And when you listen to me talking about this, see if you can recognise a movement of tension, a movement of, or a yearning to understand. See if you can recognise the mind saying I understand that, or saying I don't understand that as a thought, and how that feels. But then there's something else that attracts you to this channel, to listening to this non-dual way of speaking, and that's what in you that recognises inherently what I'm talking about, which is what I'm talking to, which is itself talking to itself, not a person talking to another person, but itself talking to itself. And this way of speaking in a way directs the attention in a way that it's a way of looking, a way of noticing, and that which seems like it understands is not the mind. It's something else. It's non-duality itself coming in as you, understanding itself inherently, as in it's already understood, it's already got, it's unknowable, or you could say that it is inherently known, so it doesn't need to be known or understood. So it's a noticing, it's not a attaining. It's very hard to talk about. But my point is, beyond the concepts, beyond the words, get in touch with that in you that recognises what I'm talking about on some level that the mind just can't understand. It doesn't make sense to the mind. The mind kind of struggles to catch up with. If you feel like, oh, I'm just not getting it, but there is something that's already got in your experience, and that seeming discord between the mind that's trying to get it and that which is here that's already got is the awakening playing itself out, is a noticing of the struggle of the entity that needs to understand in the first place. That's what to focus on when I'm talking about non-duality, because if it's taken on by the self, it's not going to make any sense at all. None whatsoever. And any sense it does make is essentially that the mind pretending to understand, to seem like it is a stable thing in this stable world, that it knows its place, but ultimately it really doesn't. Anyway, but I just wanted to Quickly talk about some interesting points that came up on in the comment section of one of the videos. I can't remember which one. And the general topic was, the topic of non-duality. And non-duality is the beginning of the clear, all I can really say is that it's some clarity on the nature of non-separation, or the whatever this is without separation. And without separation means no separate character in the middle, no one in a world relating to a world, no one relating to or understanding a concept, no one experiencing an experience that's separate from it. And there was someone made I can't remember the exact words used, but someone made the joke about what you hear often, as in there's no one here to have an experience, or there's no one here to have an emotion, or to have a thought, or whatever. And that was kind of like a dig at a dig at hardcore radical non-dualism when it becomes a belief, and the kind of obvious problem with, saying there's no one to have this experience, or have this emotion, or have this thought, because the experience, the emotion, the thought is clearly real, if you can call it that. And maybe there is no one who owns that experience, emotion, thought, but that doesn't mean that the experience, emotion, thought isn't here in this moment, isn't real. So when it becomes a belief, it can easily lead to some sort of resistance to experience, or some sort of disassociation from experience, or especially when it comes to emotions. Like the non-dual as a belief can easily be co-opted and used to distance from emotions, from experience. Whereas non-duality, if it was about anything, it would be about being immersed in the experience, moving so far into the experience, being so involved in and as it, that the person is no longer separate from it, to resist it, to take a position on it. And it's not an experience, because if you say, I experience non-duality, then or I experience no self, then there's a self referring to that experience, relating to that experience, relaying that experience as a message. And it's just not like that. Clear, I'm just going to call it non-dual. Clear non-dual is not an experience, because there's no one there to experience it. You could say there's just the experience. No one inside or outside the experience who's able to relate to it, or understand it, or point to it and say this is non-dual. That's why it's so hard to talk about it. It becomes very paradoxical, and language just doesn't quite do the job. Which is why I often don't use phrases like, or I find myself not using phrases like there's no one here, in the sense that it could be taken as a polarizing belief, because it's not about the conclusions. This realization isn't a conclusion that appears in time as a finality to a problem. I mean, relatively, there's something conclusive. Something stops, but again, it's hard to point to that and say this is what stopped. Because especially if you're in that, if you're looking from that. Or it's hard for that message to be heard when the one who's hearing is looking from that. Because then, when you're looking from that, that's all you see. Separation, time, narrative, concept. Using language to point to something that transcends, includes, all of that is difficult because language is inside that relative conceptual framework. Language is a dualistic tool, so it can't point to something outside itself effectively. Which is why when talking about this, it's always going to come across as vague and kind of doesn't make sense, paradoxical, contradictory. But there's value in the contradicting. And then when this same message is heard, it seems vague, confusing, contradictory, so it's easy to make an interpretation of that that's based on concept and belief. That's what the mind automatically does. It's not a choice, it just happens automatically. It'll go for the first thing that kind of makes sense, that has something conclusive that it can wrap its head around and say, okay, yes, this makes sense, I understand that. But it's not about taking a position on it, it's not about understanding or getting it, because the me never understands or gets this, ever. It can make its own conceptual framework about it, and it continues to do that, and the belief gives it power, gives it reality. But I can never understand something, let's say, greater than itself, or simpler than itself. You can never understand something as simple as non-duality. Someone else posted a comment talking about how there was some struggle and frustration maybe in seeing non-separation, and again, the way I describe things is just maybe it's just not effective at all in terms of non-duality. I mean, I can see that pointing to the initial recognition, I think I can do quite effectively. It's not me that's doing it. It seems to present itself behind and through the language in a subtle way, that makes it feel very simple, makes it feel very close. At least that's how it feels when I speak. But in terms of non-duality, non-separation, it's so near impossible to point to talk about, because you just can't point to it. It's more about pointing out the frameworks of thought, the assumptions of thought that are seemingly obscuring that as an illusion, but never actually obscure it. It's the obscuration isn't real, and you never get it because it's not an experience. The only thing the me, the person, the mind, thoughts can relate to and understand is an experience, a relatable experience, that it can confirm in its own way through thought and concept. That this is not an experience, so it can't be confirmed through thought and concept. It can't be pointed to, it can't be understood. It's not possible to take a position on it, and relate to it. Not in that way. It's not possible to have the experience of it and then have that experience confirmed. It's just not like that. It's because it's not in time or space, and the pointing to it is more about just noticing the senses without the mind. And the way I speak about it is, I suppose, supposed to relax the mind. It's supposed to tie up the mind so that it's almost forgotten about in the moment of that inquiry, of that looking. The one who's looking is kind of forgotten about, because it looks at itself without thought, and in that self-looking without thought, there's a stillness, a relaxation, and in that relaxation, the senses are accepted for what they are, and what they are is non-dual. There's a kind of tension, the seeking tension that, and it's very mind-driven and it's very emotion-driven. That tension seems to make reality, world, seem solid, because I'm trying to get something in it. I'm trying to look for something here that I don't have. So it's contracting, it's solidifying reality into something tangible, something that can be seen, and then when it's seen, it can be understood, it can click. That never happens. Imagine the backwards version of that. So relaxing enough that you don't care if you get it or not. That's let go of. And then when that's authentically let go of, then this recognition, this non-dual recognition, can be recognised, but not by the person, because the person never recognises it. It just recognises itself. And then in that, you can see that there wasn't a recognition to be had, because it was always the way it is anyway. That's what's weird about it. It's so hard to convey that in language. And the whole part of the self that becomes tied up with not self, tied up with self and not self, I and no I, awake and not awake, is just dropped. And simultaneously it's seen that was a huge part of the obscuration. The apparent obscuration was the attachment to spirituality, the attachment to awakening, non-duality as a concept, as something that the self can relate to, something that the self can get, or something that the self resists by denying its existence. And then this is where you hear people talk about the middle way, the fine balance of opposites, the centre of paradox where the mind can't go, And it does feel like you're walking the line sometimes. It does feel like a balance between letting go and concentrating, attention and dilation, focus and relax. Movement and stillness. Any duality you can mention. Neither one nor the other, but both. And you just can't talk about that. You can't describe a paradox other than a concept about it, which isn't paradox. The mind doesn't understand paradox, not in the sense that I'm talking about it now. But again, all that's really required, no analysis is needed, no thought is needed. Something notices, something that's not a thing notices the thoughts. They become clear as an experience, and then in that the experience is kind of the experience kind of becomes part of reality and not reality, and thus dissolves into it, let's say, or is seen through, let's say. Something gets clearer, but it's never clear to the one who's trying to understand it. But after a certain point, it just doesn't matter, because this process, this awakening, takes on a life of its own that isn't directed, isn't owned or controlled or driven by the individual. And at a certain point, the need to understand can just be dropped, because it's intuitively known that it just doesn't, it's not relevant anymore. And with that, there's a massive freedom, because you can just drop away this clinging to a lot of concepts, a lot of seeking, a lot of looking for something that's not this, because it's seen clearly that it's only this. It's seen clearly that feeling of tension, that kind of heavy driven contraction, tension that is seeking, that is looking for something that's not this, that becomes clear. And it's not so clear when you're in it, but at a certain point it becomes clear, and when it becomes clear, it loses its power, it loses its grip. There's less reality to it. It's not as heavy, it becomes light. So that's why I think it's a good idea to focus on, rather than meditating inquiry for the self-driven purpose of attaining something or getting something or having something become clear. That's why I think it's good to, with non-duality, you don't have to worry about it, you don't have to think about it, you don't have to figure it out, because I can tell you now that that's futile. Ultimately, I mean, there might be a process of that's just necessary, and that's okay, but ultimately you're not going to get it. The me never sees non-duality from here, and there's never a point where you're like, oh, I get it now, I get it, I can see non-dual, I can see it. That's what was so misleading about my earlier videos, because that's the way I described it, which was delusional. Because I got confused. The self got confused about it being an experience. The self believed it was an experience, but now it's clear that it wasn't. But I think it's helpful to find an activity, a sensory experience activity, hobby or whatever that is very enjoyable to you, and immerse yourself in that without the objectively driven goal of seeking, of attaining insight or awakening. Find that something you enjoy. So it could be art, it could be music, it could be something that's not heavy on the mind, something that doesn't require thinking. Music would be good, and become immersed in the sensory experience of the sound, the music, or whatever it might be, fully, without thought, without the reliance on thought to interpret it, to take a position on it, to analyse and understand it. It's easier with something you're good at, that you've developed the motor skills for, or the acumen for, let's say, and go as deeply into that as possible, consciously, in presence, and see what that experience is like, until you forget about the one who's experiencing, and all there is the activity, all there is the experience without the experiencer, all there is the sound, the music, without the one listening, without the one relating to it. All there is enjoyment without the enjoyer. Or say you're painting or something like that, all there is the doing, the painting, the activity, without the one doing the activity. The emotion, without the one experiencing the emotion. Because the emotion doesn't need an entity to relate to it, to understand it. It's a limitation. There's more wisdom and reality in the raw emotion than there is in the story about it. It's much more nuanced, deep, non-dual, profound. Just the emotion, just the doing, just the movement. Movement, no one moving. And you can see that the movement through the world is the world moving as itself, as you. The one moving through the world is the world moving through itself. And see if you can glimpse what I'm talking about, and then when it's glimpsed, it will be clear. It won't be clear to the person as an experience, as something that can be related to and relayed in conversation, for example, back to me. But there will be a clarity to it. It will be something clear, but it won't be clear what that is to the mind. But it will be clear that it doesn't have to be clear, because the clarity is inherent in it, the completeness is inherent in it, and it just won't matter about I or not I, self or not self, awakening or awake or not awake, non-dual or separated, relative or absolute. In that none of those distinctions even matter, and that's obvious. It's obvious, and you may not even feel compelled to talk about it, because it is clear that that's not possible, because language can't represent what I'm talking about. Experience as a memory can't represent what I'm talking about, because it's too immense, too all-encompassing, too complete, too free. Any memory of it, or projection about it, or description or concept about it, just doesn't do it justice. But you see, what I'm talking about, it seems so vague. Can you feel your mind struggling to try and understand and comprehend what I'm saying? It's incomprehensible. So that, if you feel it now, just release it, give that up, because that's an obstruction. And I need to feel stable, because you know something. This is unknowable, or you could say it's already known. So your experience right now, sensory experience, without labels, bring your attention to that experience, and then in presence, just immerse yourself in its own senses. Even thought, as the exploration of this for the simple sake of this itself, not something else, not a goal, not a higher level of understanding. Just experience for the sake of experience, without a meaning, without a purpose, without an idea. And just watch for the mind. Watch for that energetic, habitual movement of thought that comes back and tries to relay an experience back to a one who's trying to understand and interpret that experience, categorize, interpret, understand. Watch for that movement and see what it feels like, and become clear on that movement and what's actually happening there. It may feel like you're simultaneously taking a step back from the mind, but as you do that, you're taking a step forward into experience, sensory experience. You can even do it with thoughts. Rather than going into the thoughts and following, take a step back and then direct attention towards the thought. There's a strange kind of balance with that you can feel out. You feel it out, and then once there's a familiarity with that, it's just the same thing. But into the senses, and watch for that distraction. Watch for that belief that I have to pull back into thought, that's the separate position, pull back into a separate position to relate to all this, to understand all this. That position doesn't exist. That position, that will collapse, and then that's when all this collapses on itself infinitely collapses on itself. And that's what people called it, the free fall, where there's no one at the centre holding all of this experience together as the one relating to it. But whoever made that comment is right. There's no point in saying there's no one here to. It just doesn't make sense. From that non-experience, it just doesn't make sense to even talk about it, never mind make a conclusive statement like there's no one here to own this experience. I mean, that's pretty much what I'm saying, but the point is ongoing, infinitely ongoing, not conclusive, not pull back into a position, take that position as final, this is the category for this, and then that's it, and then come back to that position again to reconfirm itself, because it's flimsily propped up It doesn't feel free fluid. It doesn't feel infinite. It feels cardboard. It feels plastic. It feels artificial. It's ongoing, infinitely ongoing, without somewhere to stop and regroup and say, this is this way, this is that way, this is the way it is, this is the way it isn't. That's the limitation. That's resistance. That's resisting what is infinite, which is this. The self takes a position to feel stable, to feel secure, to feel like it knows what's going. It's a safety thing. It's a fear thing. Because infinity is the most terrifying thing for the me, the self. It doesn't want that, because it loses itself. It's death. So that pulling back, that position, that energetic tension that feels so heavy is a fear of death, essentially. Is trying to stay alive. It does it automatically. It's just a survival mechanism that's built up from conditioning, and then you can have love for that and accept that for what it is, not resist that as another thing. Not resist the believer because it's believed to be a bad thing, a negative thing. Not resist the thoughts because the thought says, I believe thought is a negative thing, a bad thing. There's a love and acceptance and a compassion and empathy for the illusion itself, and understanding, transcendent wisdom in that mystery of the one who relates, the illusion of the self, or samsara, or whatever they call it in the traditions. There's a wisdom in that is non-duality itself, not separate from the relative and the absolute are not separate, are one. Nothing is separate. Nothing is two. Nothing. So see if you can become familiar with that, taking a position on and separating into this or that, because that's the obstruction. Does it feel like I'm looking for something? Does it feel like I'm not quite getting something? Then look at the I that's not getting it. Look at that thought and that feeling, that assumption that I have to get something. Yeah, that assumption that I have to understand something by categorizing it as correct or incorrect, right or wrong, this or that. And you don't need to think about it. Just give up on the thinking about it, because that's you don't need to believe a thought. You just don't need to. It's more about the energetic feeling of what is inspiring that line of thinking, that concept. What is the feeling that comes from? Especially when we're talking about the non-duality, non-separation. What is the feeling, the underlying subtle energetic movement under that, feeling under that? That's where the money is on this one. The feeling, like what is that feeling that is seemingly inspiring these strong beliefs about the way it is, or the way I have to be, or what I have to get. Explore that, go right into that, and it doesn't need to be understood. It just needs to be felt with clarity. It just has to be clear. Clarity isn't understanding of the mind. Clarity isn't I can't really describe to you what clarity is. Clarity is non-dual. Clarity is not having to be clear, because it's inherently clear. If that makes sense. I'm sure it doesn't, but it's already figured out. It doesn't need to be got. It's a massive weight off your shoulders, so you can just Move into the sensation, move into the senses, and just stay there. And see that there's no one that needs to stay there, because that's all there is. And if a thought comes up, if a thought comes up, recognize it as a thought. And then feel the feeling behind it as fully as possible. Orient yourself into that feeling, into that emotional charge, into that energetic movement. And you see that it seems to be physical, it seems to be in the body. And just feel that fully, without resistance, without the need to understand. And it becomes, when the belief in thought isn't there in the moment, it becomes much more about sensation. Sense is the source of all experience. They seem to have led to the emotional flavour of experience, which then leads to the thoughts about it. Get in touch with the emotional flavour. Don't try and cause it. It's uncaused. It happens spontaneously, but it's coming closer to the sensation then, closer to the senses. Another thing is, it's with this zero distance, this non-separation, this all clarified after awakening, after that realistic circuit of beliefs and thoughts and self as the most overwhelming identity was broken, pretty much. Had been dwarfed by the recognition of something more infinite, more vast than that. So I think it's necessary to have this this releasing of identity, let's say, prior to this clarification of let's say non-dual nature. But it's not like you need to worry about that, because at that point it's kind of happening on its own. It's kind of directing itself. It's kind of intuitively obvious where to where it's going, or what needs to be looked at, or what needs to be seen, in a sense. Anyway, that's a long video. I'll go for now, and I'll talk to you next time.